you are relying on perceptions rather than actual facts. If you know that you're doing that right now, then we have to assume that this may have also happened earlier. And so when we're looking at an event, election in 1980, election in 1976, election in 1972, Watergate, Cuban Missile Crisis, whatever these big events are, we have to recognize that there is going to be perhaps a gap between what we know about something. When I mean know, I don't mean like facts. I mean what our common public knowledge of it is. Something that we had when we came into this class. There's a difference between that common perception versus the facts. If you know that, then when you're doing your historical research, you have to account for it. You have to keep in mind that what you think that you know, what you thought you were absolutely certain of, you might, if you really think about it, you might realize that you don't really know this. That it's something that somebody told you, it sounded right, and it's stuck in your head ever since. I'm trying to think right now of something in my head, some factoid that I had. I remember, this is a perfect one. Baker, Miller, Pink. This isn't going to make any sense to you, but it makes perfect sense to me. Baker, Miller, Pink. My psych professor in high school, and I loved this guy, right? My psych professor in high school, and he was a teacher, was telling me about Baker, Miller, Pink being particularly soothing to the senses. You put Baker, Miller, Pink, that particular kind of pink. We were talking about Gestalt for psychology, which was all about perceptions. You put Baker, Miller, Pink on the walls, and people just get naturally calm. So he told me this, right? So boom, fact, absolutely didn't even question it. So I was going off doing my life, and whatever it is, I got this college job where I'm painting, and I'm working at this Salvation Army women's shelter. And these are pregnant mothers, unwed mothers, and they wanted me to paint the wall. And the guy says, "Well, what color do you think we should do it?" What did I say immediately? Baker, Miller, Pink. This is it. This has been proven. This will make everyone calm. So I bought 12 gallons of Baker, Miller, Pink, right? And I'm starting doing the wall. And after I've gotten like 3 walls done, the people go in there, they go, "Ah!" It's the ugliest color in the planet, right? And their anxiety went through the roof just looking at the color because they just didn't like it. But I had been convinced that Baker, Miller, Pink was clearly because the teacher told me. So it snuck into my head. It became a fact. I never questioned it, didn't bother to actually go and try to research to see if what he said was actually true. It was just there. It was perfect. Now, it turns out that all that 12 gallons of paint had to be thrown out because nobody was going to touch it. They hated it. They ended up putting something like brown or tan or something else. But Baker, Miller, Pink is in my head. I'm sure that in your life, and occasionally I'll have something where my dad would have said something when I was like 7 or 8, right? And it just was perfect. It sounded perfectly. Now that I'm a historian, I look back and I think, no, that just was not true. There'll be times when that'll happen. You'll know it. You'll remember. Well, in history, this happens all the time. Something that you just know, it gets fixed in your head. You know it as a fact. But then you have to ask yourself, did you really look into that? Did you really look up the research behind that? Or did you just have someone else tell you verbally? If it's written down, chances are likely, more often than not, they're not lying to you. They may disagree with the interpretation, but the facts are probably right. If you hear it, if it's a verbal communication, that's when you're a bit more trouble. But even when it's written down, I tell you mistakes that are in the textbook all the time. Just because it's in the textbook doesn't mean that it's right. You have to kind of go back and do some extra research. The problem of a survey-level class is that we don't have time to dig up the primary resources and give every single fact behind this. But because you are college students, at some point in your life, you should. And when we consider this history, you may like the interpretation, you may hate the interpretation, but this history that is within our living memory. In other words, the memory of your parents, your grandparents, your uncles, whatever, and they start telling you things. there should be just a big bell ringing in the back of your head. Okay? It's not that I don't think they're right. They could be totally right. But until you spread that to someone else, you have to have some type of piece of evidence, something to verify whether or not you're there. Because it's very common for us perceptions to win over the reality. This is a complex argument. He'll tell you that we haven't talked about this in our Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. We've talked about it here because it's a little bit more of an opportunity. You take it as you wish. When you do your interpretation, if you have this in the back of your mind, maybe you might be a little more thorough. We'll see how it goes. So that was one thing we're talking about.